Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Jonah Redding, and before everything went to hell, I was nobody special. I ran a cheap booking website from my kitchen table, fielded calls on a cracked cell phone, and scraped together a living renting out a single floating cabin anchored in the bay. It was a simple place, honestly, something tourists loved way more than it deserved. It was just 2 small rooms, a narrow deck, strings of discount lights from the hardware store, and just enough rustic comfort to make a weekend feel like an escape. Most days were easy back then. My routine was simple: hauling heavy coolers, swapping out propane tanks for the grill, making sure the water pump didn't sputter and lose its prime, and cleaning up after folks who treated no smoking like a polite suggestion rather than a rule. Couples came out for anniversaries they couldn't afford to celebrate in the city. Fishing buddies came to drink beer for 3 days straight. They took photos of the sunset, tagged them online, and called me the cabin guy to their friends. The bay had a rhythm in those days. You could hear music drifting from the dive bar on the pier, charter captains shouting over their idling engines, glass bottles clinking in recycling bins, and kids screaming when a crab trap actually worked. I knew that soundtrack by heart. I could tell you the time of day just by how the noise rolled across the water. But the first days of the outbreak warped that rhythm. Sirens started bleeding into the background noise behind town. At first they were just an annoyance, then they became constant. One night I watched an ambulance crawl along the coastal road, lights flashing red and blue against the trees, but no cars moved out of its way. The next morning, 3 different guests canceled within the same hour. None of them asked for their deposits back. Online, the word Outbreak went from a headline you scrolled past to the only thing anyone could scream about. In town, locals were buying fuel cans and bottled water like a hurricane was tracking our way. But out here on the bay, bobbing on the water, we were still pretending the world was normal. The morning I finally decided to abandon the mainland, I stood beside the marina office clutching a cup of cold coffee and absolutely no plan. For a decade, I had made a modest living renting out a floating cabin in this bay. A plain little box on a float where city people came to drink cheap wine on the deck and pretend their problems were a million miles away. I knew dock fees better than I knew politics. I worried about storm surges and dry rot, not viral outbreaks, but the noise at the marina had changed. Gone were the sounds of laughter or arguments about where to eat dinner. Instead, people were shouting at the fuel dock, their voices sharp, flat, and edged with panic. A woman shoved a man away from a pump with both hands, screaming about it being her turn. A kid was sobbing while his father dragged him toward a boat stacked so high with duffel bags it looked ready to capsize. Near the ramp, 2 security guards tried to push back a man with dark blood smeared across his sleeve. He moved with a strange, shuffling slowness, until suddenly, he didn't. When he dropped his head and tore into the guard's neck with his teeth, the entire pier seemed to freeze in horror. My gut reaction was the same as everyone else's: run, get inland, get away. I bolted home, threw a duffel of clothes and a plastic tub of canned food into my truck, and drove up to the ridge that overlooks the main highway. That's where the reality hit me. The lane heading out of town was a parking lot, bumper to bumper, stretching all the way past the curve and out of sight. Some doors hung open where people had just given up. One sedan sat sideways across 2 lanes, the result of a panicked 3-point turn that went wrong. A thin black line of smoke rose from somewhere miles ahead. Nothing was moving. The air smelled of exhaust fumes and overheating engines. I sat there with my truck idling and my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. Driving into that mess didn't look like an escape plan. It looked like parking my life in a metal coffin in the middle of a trap. If the infection, or whatever this was moving through crowds, that highway was a slaughterhouse waiting to happen. When I turned the truck around and rolled back down the hill toward the water, it felt like a mistake, but the other option felt like suicide. Back at my empty house, I opened my laptop and stared at the booking photo for the cabin. Blue water, pale sky, 2 happy idiots clinking glasses on the deck. For years, that image was just a product I sold. Now, staring at it while sirens wailed outside, it looked like a lifeline. The cabin sat in a quiet, neglected corner of the bay, far off the main traffic channels, anchored to 4 ancient pilings that had been sunk into the mud before I was born. There was no engine, no steering wheel. To reach it, you had to take my small skiff from the marina. 10 minutes in calm weather, 15 with a chop. From the street, you couldn't see it at all. Dense reeds and a cluster of rotting moorings blocked the view. Most guests only found it because I emailed them a crude map with a big red circle and the words, "Your hideout," written as a joke. The joke was on me now. There was a rumor circulating around the docks, scuttlebutt from the fishermen, that whatever this sickness was, it didn't do well in deep water. One deckhand claimed he saw a man chase someone off the end of Pier 3, step into the dark water and never come back up. Sink like a stone, he said. Maybe he was lying. Maybe he was just trying to talk himself out of a panic attack. All I knew was that the footage on the news showed these things sprinting on pavement and climbing stairs. None of those clips showed them swimming. I pulled a crumpled envelope from a junk drawer and started making a list, strictly out of habit the way I used to before hurricane season. Water jugs, canned food, first aid kit, flashlights, batteries, marine rope, tool bag, gas for the outboard. Then I stopped thinking like a landlord and started thinking like a fugitive. I raided the bathroom for every bottle of medicine I could find, antibiotics, painkillers, rubbing alcohol. I grabbed extra wool blankets, heavy coats, and every scrap of food in the pantry that didn't need a refrigerator. I wasn't packing for a weekend getaway anymore. I was packing for a one-way trip. My skiff still sat in its slip, rocking gently against the fenders, oblivious to the chaos. Loading it felt like stealing from my own future, but there was nobody left to ask for permission. 2 5-gallon blue water jugs went under the forward bench for ballast. The heavy tub of canned food went dead center. I wedged my tool bag and the first aid kit near the stern, added a spare anchor, more rope than seemed reasonable, and 2 extra tanks of fuel. If I forgot something today, I wasn't going to be able to run to the store tomorrow to get it. The cabin revealed itself the way it always had as I approached, a low, unassuming square behind the wall of reeds, then resolving into a small house on a float with dull, weather-beaten paint and a crooked screen door. The cheap string lights along the roofline hung dead and gray. The deck chairs were stacked exactly where the last couple had left them. It still looked like a cheap rental, the kind of place you vacuum out between guests and immediately forget. Except now, it was the only piece of real estate in this bay that wasn't nailed to the infected dirt. I cut the engine early, letting the skiff glide the last 50 yards so the sound of the motor would die away before I reached the reeds. The bow bumped the float with a soft, hollow knock. My hands tied the cleat knot out of muscle memory, but my mind was shifting gears. For 10 years, I had handed the keys to this place to strangers. Now I was stepping onto it as if it were a fortress. I crossed the deck, unlocked the door, and closed it behind me. The click of the latch sounded louder than it ever had before. The cabin smelled the way it always did, a mix of bleach, stale coffee, and damp wood that had soaked up years of bay water. Sunlight streamed through the front windows, illuminating dust motes dancing over the little pine table where guests used to toss their keys without a second thought. For years, this place had been nothing more than a weekend box for tourists, a backdrop for selfies. Today, it was the only structure I could think of that wasn't nailed to the infected ground. I dropped my duffel bag on the bench and pushed the door shut until the latch clicked home. Inside, stripped of the glossy filter of my website photos, everything looked rougher. The couch sagged in the middle, the trim around the windows was chipped, and the laminate floor bore a long, ugly scratch from where someone had dragged a cooler. This was still just a rental cabin, flimsy and cheap, not a fortified safe house. If I wanted this plywood box to keep me alive, I had to stop treating it like an investment property. I walked through the rooms like I was doing a turnover between guests, only this time I wasn't looking for stains or missing towels. I was looking for weaknesses. The bathroom sink ran after a few sputtering coughs from the pump, and the toilet flushed and refilled with a noisy gurgle. In the kitchenette, I threw open every cabinet door, paper towels, a few rolls of toilet paper, a box of trash bags, mismatched plates, utensils, a jar of peanut butter, 2 half-used bags of rice, some cooking oil, salt, and sugar. My plastic tub of canned food almost doubled the total calorie count in the room. It wasn't much. I organized everything on the lower pantry shelf with obsessive precision. Heavy cans in the back, lighter boxes in front. The water jugs went under the table, placed carefully on a folded towel so the plastic wouldn't grind against the floor with every shift of the tide. I stashed the flashlights, spare batteries, and the first aid kit on the high shelf above the couch, where no accidental spill could ruin them. With every item I placed, the cabin felt less like a stage prop and more like a place with rules. Then I tried to call my sister. I sat at the table and dialed. The call rang once, a hollow digital trill, and then cut to dead silence. I tried again. This time it didn't even ring. My text messages remained stubborn gray bubbles, no delivered marks, just silence screaming back at me from the screen. I stared at her name until my vision blurred and my throat tightened so hard it hurt to swallow. I wanted to imagine she was fine, stuck in traffic, battery dead. But I knew better. I set the phone face down on the table like a losing hand of cards. Whatever horror was unfolding inland, I wasn't driving back into it tonight. Out here, at least, I had a few hundred yards of water between me and the next bad decision. There was still light left in the sky, and daylight is when you fix things. I stepped back onto the deck and walked the perimeter of the float. The cabin sat on 4 old pontoons chained to driven pilings with heavy galvanized hardware. I checked each chain and shackle I could reach, testing them with my full weight. There was rust, sure, but no deep flakes, nothing that looked ready to snap. My skiff bumped gently against the side rails. I doubled both mooring lines and added a third from the bow to a corner cleat. If I lost that boat, I lost my only bridge back to the world. Sound carries on flat water like a skipped stone, so I hunted down every loose bit of gear on the deck. The folding chairs rattled when the float rocked. The small metal bistro table scraped if it tipped. Even the hook on the screen door squealed metal on metal when I moved it. I brought the chairs inside and stacked them, laid the table on its side, and wrapped a rag through the eye of the hook so it would close silently. Along the edge, I tightened each fender line until the cabin's movement settled into one slow, dampened roll. By late afternoon, the bay turned a bruised gray, and the townside became a collection of dark, silent blocks against the sky. Occasionally, a sharp sound would skip across the water. A shout, a car horn held down too long, blaring until it died. One short, dry crack that might have been a gunshot or a board snapping. I stood on the deck, listened, and tried to convince myself that those noises were far away and out of my reach. Inside, I flipped the main overhead light on and immediately flipped it off. It made the cabin glow like a lantern in a dark field, a beacon for anyone looking for a target. I picked a small desk lamp instead and aimed it at the ceiling so the light diffused softly without hitting the windows directly. Then I took a spare blanket from the bedroom and pinned it over the biggest front picture window with pushpins from the junk drawer. For years, I had sold this view for $200 a night. Tonight, I covered it on purpose. Before I lay down, I made one simple rule for the night. No loud tools, no music, no radio above a whisper. If someone yelled from the water, I would stay quiet unless they already knew my name. The dead might struggle to reach a float in deep water, but the living had boats, fear, and bad ideas. I couldn't save anyone by shouting back. I could only give away my position. I slept on the couch fully dressed, boots on the floor within arm's reach, a blanket pulled up to my chest. Sleep was thin and brittle. Every time the cabin shifted, I snapped awake and listened. Once it was just the tide pushing harder on the port corner. Another time it was the skiff tapping a fender when the wind swung around. Around the middle of the night, I heard a heavy wet splash off the port side, something big hitting the water. Then came a low gurgling sound that rose and faded like air escaping from lungs until the water was quiet again. I lay frozen, counting slowly in my head until my breathing matched the small creaks in the cabin frame. I didn't get up. I didn't look out the window. If something was close enough for me to see it, it was close enough to see me. I lay there until the gray light of dawn finally seeped back into the room, bringing the shapes of the table and door back into focus. My neck ached and my eyes burned, but the float was still here and the chains still held. The first night on the water was over. Locking the cabin down started with the front door. Until yesterday, guests had treated it like a rustic decoration, something you left wide open to catch a breeze while you carried suitcases inside. Today, that flimsy panel was the only piece of wood standing between me and anyone desperate enough to paddle out here. I opened it and inspected the frame. The latch plate was held in place by two short, pathetic screws that barely bit into the trim. A solid kick would rip the plate loose and send the door swinging. I dug under the sink for my toolbox, found the longest hardened deck screws I owned and drove them through the plate deep into the stud until the metal sat flush and tight. Then I installed a heavy-duty slide bolt higher up, so the door locked in two places instead of one. None of that would stop a sledgehammer or a determined battering, but it would make a hell of a lot of noise and buy me seconds. I dragged the small pine dresser from the bedroom and shoved it against the handle side, bracing its legs on a rubber mat so it wouldn't slide easily. On top, I stacked heavy wool blankets and a plastic tub full of cleaning supplies. If someone forced the door, they would have to shove half the room aside before they even saw where I was standing. The windows were the next vulnerability. The big front picture window was already hidden behind a blanket, but the side and rear glass still exposed me to open water. I didn't have sheets of plywood, and I certainly wasn't walking back into town to scavenge for them, so I used what I had. Extra bath towels, an old faded comforter, and spare curtains I had never bothered to hang. I folded them double to increase the density, pressed them over the frames, and secured them with duct tape and pushpins. I knew I wasn't building a bomb shelter. Glass is brittle. A rock could still shatter it. My goal was simply to kill reflections and cut the interior glow. If frightened people in loud boats came searching the shoreline for signs of life, I didn't want my lamp to be a lighthouse beacon drawing them in. I wanted to be invisible against the dark reeds. Noise was the next enemy. I walked the floor in my socks, stepping slowly, listening to the cabin's bones. The long scratch near the kitchen creaked whenever I put weight on one end. I laid a thin runner rug over it and dropped a folded blanket in the narrow hallway leading to the bathroom. Soft underfoot meant less chance of a sharp, betraying squeak when the float rolled in the wake of a passing boat. Hinges and latches got the same obsessive treatment. Cabinet doors that clicked too loudly when they closed got small felt pads from a pack I kept for picky guests. A dab of dish soap on the worst hinge took the high-pitched squeal out of it. The dresser drawers liked to rattle against their tracks when the cabin rocked, so I ran a strip of cloth through the handles and tied them together tight. Out on the deck, I checked everything that could chatter or bang. One rail board lifted slightly when the water slapped the bottom of the float. A few turns of the driver pulled it down solid. The mooring line from my skiff to the cleat squeaked rhythmically each time the hull moved. I added a second safety rope and took an extra wrap around a rubber bumper until the connection was just a soft, dull rub. Even the simple hook on the screen door used to squeal when it caught the eye. I looped electrical tape through the ring and around the post so it settled without a sound. Power was simple, but it needed strict rules. The cabin relied on a small solar panel array on the roof and a pair of marine deep cycle batteries in a vented locker by the stern. I shut the fridge off completely and propped the door open with a towel so it wouldn't grow mold. From now on, the batteries were for LED lights and the water pump only. The meter still showed the bank almost full, hovering near 13 volts. I wanted to keep it that way. One lamp at night, brief bursts of the pump for water. No ceiling fans, no charging extra devices. If heavy clouds rolled in for a week, I didn't want to sit in the dark and regret every time I had lit up the place just for comfort. Water came next, and that was the tricky part. I had the 2 blue jugs I'd brought from shore and whatever the cabin's main tank still held. I opened the inspection hatch and the floor dipped a marked measuring stick and watched the wet line return just over the halfway mark. Enough to work with for a while, but not enough to waste. I set the hierarchy. Drinking first, cooking second, washing last. No running taps, just to hear the soothing sound of water. Bay water was everywhere, but drinking it straight was suicide. Even with a filter, the salt content in this part of the bay was too high. I found a camping filter a guest had left behind, but that would only work for bacteria, not salt. If the fresh water ran out, I would have to rig a tarp on the roof to catch rain. I made a mental note to check the gutters for debris tomorrow. For now, the tank was my lifeline. Food got the same hard, calculating look. I spread every can, bag, and box on the table and made a quick inventory list on the back of an envelope. Beans, soup, tuna, canned fruit, diced tomatoes, rice, pasta, peanut butter, crackers, oatmeal. It looked decent, almost plentiful, until I divided it by days. If I ate like my guests did, 3 squares and snacks, it would disappear in 2 weeks. So I cut the ration down immediately. 1 solid meal a day, 1 smaller snack, nothing extra just because I was bored or scared. I put most of the cans back in the cabinet and only kept what I needed for the next 3 days on the counter where I could see it. That way, opening a new can became a conscious choice, not a mindless habit. By the time the light outside began to fade into a bruised purple, my hands were sore from turning screws and tying knots. The cabin no longer looked like the idyllic pictures on my website. The couch carried a heavy toolbox at one end. The table sat crowded with my lists and survival gear. The front window was a sheet instead of a view. To a tourist, it would have looked ruined, a disaster. To me, it finally looked like it belonged to someone who actually planned to stay alive. Learning to stay quiet took practice. I thought I understood silence from early mornings on the marina, when all you heard was rigging tapping against masts and a gull or two. That wasn't silence. That was peace. This was different. Here, every sound felt like a risk. The first mistake was a pan. I was making rice on the little stove, moving too fast, thinking like a host instead of someone hiding. The handle slipped, the pan bounced off the burner, and the lid hit the floor with a sharp metal clap. The sound punched through the cabin and out over the deck. A second later, it bounced back from the seawall across the bay. It was a clean, unnatural noise, the kind that doesn't exist in nature, and it carried a signature that screamed human to anyone listening. I froze. My hand hovered over the lid. For a few long seconds, there was nothing, just my own breath and the small tick of the burner. Then, faint but clear, an engine turned over near town. Another boat answered, closer. Someone revved high, like they were angry or scared. Voices carried, too far for words, but close enough to know they were shouting. That was all it took. One dropped pan and half the bay felt awake. I shut the stove off, set the pan down on a folded towel, and turned off the lamp. The cabin dropped into a gray-blue dim. I sat with my back against the wall and counted to 100 while the engines faded and the shouting turned into a low, distant hum again. When the noise finally settled, I put that pan away on a shelf with a towel under it so it would never hit bare wood again. After that, I started listening on purpose. Not for drama, just for patterns. Sound on water travels in straight lines until it hits something. The hillside behind town threw voices back toward me like a wall. The far point near the channel split echoes into 2 faint threads. I learned which directions meant trouble. High, tight voices with engines meant people still arguing over fuel or space. Slow, uneven thumps against pilings meant boats left loose or bodies hitting wood. The worst sound was a steady, wet dragging from shore, the kind you hear when something that should walk is forced to crawl. One afternoon, not long after the pan incident, a small runabout limped past my inlet. The motor coughed and died, then caught, then died again. I heard 3 people arguing on board. One wanted to pull into my cove and tie up. Another said there was nothing back here but mud and old pilings. They drifted close enough that I could hear every word. "There's cabins out here," one voice said. "I've seen them online. Rentals or something." "Rentals aren't stocked," another answered. "They've got cheap wine and board games, not food. We waste daylight for nothing." The third voice cut in, sharp. "Shut up and listen. The highway's blocked, town's full of them, and we're burning gas going in circles. Any roof that floats is better than open water. He sounded like a man who had already lost an argument with a locked door earlier that day and wasn't going to take no for an answer again. They were right about some of that. They were wrong about my supplies. I stayed still on the floor with my head level with the window line. The front blanket cut most of their view. From their angle, the cabin should have looked dark and abandoned. The motor died a final time and the boat drifted for a minute. Someone threw something metal in frustration. It clanged against their hull and echoed. That sound drew an answer from the far shore, a series of low, broken calls that did not belong to any bird. The voices on the boat dropped at once. "Go," the sharp one said. "Now. Paddles. No more noise." They did not come into the cove. The runabout slid past the mouth of my inlet, 2 oars dipping the water in clumsy rhythm. I waited until I could not hear them at all, then waited longer. My dinner went cold and clumped in the pot, but my spot stayed secret. Hunger was easier to fix than someone else's panic at my door. That night I made new rules for sound. No dropped metal, no loose handles, no doors that could slam. Anything that could rattle got tied, wedged, or padded. I wrapped tape around the mug handles I used most so porcelain would not hit porcelain. The kettle got a strip of cloth between lid and rim. When I moved the chairs, I lifted them instead of dragging them. I moved different too. Instead of stomping from one end of the cabin to the other like I did on cleaning days, I learned how to roll my weight. Heel down soft, then the ball of my foot, then the other foot. On bad nights when the cabin rocked, I sat instead of pacing. The urge to walk off nervous energy was strong, but sliding into something or bumping a wall was not worth the trade. The hardest part was my own voice. I had lived alone for years, but I still talked to myself sometimes, small comments about weather or work. On the 2nd or 3rd day out here, I caught myself about to say something out loud to an empty room. I stopped with my mouth open. Talking felt wrong now, like lighting a flare inside a dark car. So I kept most thoughts in my head and saved my voice for when I really needed it. Short phrases, quiet, never more than a few words at a time. If a boat motor popped near the outer markers, I said nothing. If I heard that soft dragging from shore, I turned off any light and sat with my hands flat on the floor until the sound faded. Learning to stay quiet wasn't about fear of the dead in the water. I still hadn't seen one make it this far out. It was about the living, and the way desperation changes what people think they're allowed to do. Silence kept me. I first saw Issa standing at the end of a broken dock, 3 warped, sun-bleached boards clinging to rot-eaten pilings at the overgrown edge of my cove. I was on the front deck pretending to check a mooring line I already trusted, just to have a reason to be outside without looking like a sentry. The reeds shifted with a dry rustle and she stepped out slowly, one hand gripping a post for balance, moving like her legs were close to giving out but her will was pushing them forward anyway. She looked rough. She wore a small, dusty tactical backpack and a denim jacket tied tightly at her waist. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, messy knot, and a strip of sunburn marked a raw line across her cheeks. For a few long seconds, she ignored the cabin entirely and watched the smoke that was still hanging low over the town like a bruise. The bay was quiet enough that I could hear the water slapping rhythmically under the dock and the heavy breath she let out when she finally turned her head and saw the cabin floating there. She took in the blankets pinned over the front windows, the doubled-up lines on the cleats, and my skiff tied tight alongside. Her shoulders dropped an inch as if she understood instantly that this was not a weekend rental anymore. She didn't wave. She didn't shout for help. Instead, she checked the tree line behind her with a paranoid twitch of her head and spoke in a low conversational voice. Of course, there's a rental cabin tucked in a corner like this. Sound carries straight and true on this water, so I heard her clearly even though I stayed crouched behind the rail with my hands flat on the warm wood. She shaded her eyes against the glare, stared directly at the covered glass and said, "If anyone out there is still breathing, I'm not here to steal your place. I just need to know if the bay is dead too or if I walked the right way." The way she said it sounded more tired than afraid. It was the voice of someone who had run out of adrenaline 3 days ago. I knew that not answering would eventually send her away, but answering might bring her closer, and bringing her closer might bring whoever was chasing her. I thought about how long it had been since I heard a human voice that wasn't a distant, angry argument or a panicked radio broadcast. I weighed the risk, then picked the smallest reply I could live with. "Some of us are still breathing," I said, keeping my voice flat. Her head snapped toward me. She squinted until she picked my silhouette out above the rail. "Are you the owner? Or did you break in like everyone else?" "I own it," I said. "I used to rent it out. Now I'm just staying here until I see a better idea than a highway full of stopped cars and open doors." She let out a thin breath that almost turned into a laugh. "I used to park cars for the people who stayed in places like this," she said. "I'm done listening to engine noise and shouted plans that don't work." She checked the tree line again, her eyes scanning the shadows. "Can I come closer without you putting a round through me? Because I've had enough of people who think making noise with a gun is a plan." "I don't shoot at people," I said, watching the reeds more than her face. "But I don't like noise. If you come in quiet. No shouting from the dock, no heavy boots, no engines unless we have to move." She nodded once, sharp and quick. "Quiet is fine by me." She walked to the last sturdy board, stepped off into the shallows, and waded forward without hesitation while the murky water climbed past her knees. I untied the bowline and let the skiff drift clear of the float, then eased it toward her with slow, silent oar strokes instead of starting the motor. When I got close, I told her to get in easy and not slam the hull. She just whispered, "I know," and slid into the boat with the grace of someone who knew how to keep her center of gravity low. She sat with her hands gripping the gunnels so the skiff barely rocked. We moved back toward the cabin with only the rhythmic dip of the oars and the drip of water for a soundtrack. Up close, she looked scraped and used, the way people do when they have walked farther than they ever planned to. Her running shoes were split at the toes, duct tape was wrapped thickly around one ankle, and the backpack straps had cut deep lines into the fabric of her shirt. When we bumped the float, she stood, stepped onto the deck with a practiced shift of her weight, and looked down at the extra lines on my cleats before she even looked at the door. "I'm Issa," she said as she adjusted her grip on the pack. I told her my name. She told me she had followed the service road until it turned into a graveyard of stalled cars, then cut through backyards, drainage ditches, and a dry creek bed to stay away from anything that sounded like people. "Every time I heard voices," she said, staring at the water, "it was just another fight over the same few cans of peaches. I'm done with that." She looked around the cove, then back at the cabin. "What's the rent to stay near you? Inside or tied off next to you? I'm not asking for much, just one place where footsteps don't always mean somebody is about to swing a tire iron." I told her the price was simple. We keep our voices low. We don't run bright lights at night. We don't start the engine unless we have to. We share what we have and everybody works. Because one person trying to watch every angle always misses something, Issa looked me in the eye. "I can handle that. I have some cans, a small pump filter, a few bandages, and antibiotics I pulled from a clinic back room before they locked the doors. And I'm not dragging anyone loud behind me." Letting her in meant this stopped being just my shelter and started being ours. It meant trusting a stranger with my back. But leaving her on that broken dock meant pretending I hadn't seen someone who still understood why quiet mattered. In the end, one choice felt worse than the other. I opened the door, stepped aside, and gestured into the dim cabin. "You can stay for now," I said. "We'll see how it goes." Marek showed up the morning after Issa and I counted our food supply for the third time, trying to make the math work in our favor. We were huddled at the small pine table with cans of beans and tuna spread out like poker chips when Issa suddenly froze. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. A dull, rhythmic thump ran along the side of the float, followed by a wet slapping sound and a short, desperate grunt. I grabbed the pry bar from its spot by the door, signaled Issa to stay back, and eased the door open just enough to see the deck. A man was hanging onto the edge of the float with both hands, his knuckles white, while his legs kicked weakly in the dark water, trying to find purchase on the slime-covered hull. He wore a faded orange life jacket over a gray work shirt that was streaked with grease and fuel. One sleeve was stiff and dark with dried blood, and his fingers were pale and pruned from the cold, but his eyes were clear, terrified, and locked on the boards. I kept my voice low but firm. "If you stay quiet, we'll pull you up. If you make a sound, you swim." He nodded once, spitting out a mouthful of brackish water. "Quiet's fine," he rasped. "Just don't let go." Issa stepped in beside me without a word. We braced our feet on the non-slip strips, each grabbed a wrist and hauled. He was heavy, waterlogged clothes always are, but we dragged him up until he slid over the edge and hit the deck with a wet thud. He rolled onto his back, coughing up water, and stared at the gray sky as if he hadn't expected to see it again. "Name's Marek Doyle," he wheezed. "I didn't sign up for the swim. Somebody on shore tried to settle an argument with a hunting rifle, and my boat happened to be behind theirs." Issa kept her eyes scanning the water behind him. "Anyone jump in after you?" He shook his head, water dripping from his nose. "If they did, they're under the hull or they're still yelling on the pier." The life jacket had a melted patch on the shoulder, and a long, jagged cut ran down his left forearm. It looked sharp and clean, not torn. I kept the pry bar low at my leg, ready to swing. "Any bites?" He saw the look in my eyes and immediately turned his arm so we could see the wound clearly. "Just shrapnel and glass. I've seen what teeth do this week, man. If they'd gotten hold of me, I wouldn't be talking to you, I'd be trying to eat you." Issa knelt, handed him a water bottle, and told him to sip, not chug. He listened, taking small, trembling swallows. While he recovered his breath, I asked the question that mattered most. "How bad is it on land since the last time I checked?" Marek wiped his mouth. "The lower streets are finished. It's a parking lot, cars nose to nose, doors hanging open, glass everywhere. The gas station by the marina burned 2 nights ago. What didn't melt got stripped by looters. The dead. They just lean on anything that makes noise until it breaks. The living lean on anything that looks like it might have food inside." Issa glanced toward the side window, her face tight. "Anybody still up in the houses?" "Some," Marek said. "You see lights flick on after dark, then snap off the second the things in the street turn toward them. It's a game of hide and seek, and everyone is losing." He tried to sit up and winced in pain. I grabbed his elbow while Issa took the other side, and we helped him inside. We closed the door and slid the dresser back into place. "This place stays low," I told him, locking eyes. "No shouting, no bright windows, no engine unless we have to move. If you stay, you follow that. No exceptions." He nodded, looking around the fortified cabin. "You won't hear me unless you need me." Issa crossed her arms. "What can you do besides float and breathe?" Marek managed a weak grin. "Small motors, pumps, lines, hull patches. I worked the commercial docks and rentals for 20 years. I can keep an outboard alive with spit and wire, and I know when not to tie up next to someone who looks hungry." I asked how he ended up near our secluded cove. He explained that his boat was drifting after the fire at the marina, engine dead. He had pointed the bow toward the darkest, thickest reeds he could see, and jumped when the flames got too close to the fuel tank. We let him rest on the floor by the wall until his hands stopped shaking. Later, we showed him the narrow strip of shore visible through the side window gap. 3 of the dead were working their way along the seawall, bumping against the same railing over and over until one finally slid around it, and the others followed blindly. Marek watched them with a dark expression. They don't climb well, they don't swim, and they don't think. But they never stop pressing. That's the nightmare. They just keep pushing. As we watched, one of the figures slipped on the wet concrete and went over the edge. It hit the water with a splash, flailed clumsily, then hung there until its fingers slid off the slime-covered wall and it dropped out of sight into the murky depth. "That's why I headed for the marsh instead of another block," Issa said quietly. Marek nodded. Water's the only fence that still works. Doors just slow them down. Just then a boat engine roared to life near the mouth of the bay, low at first, then screaming high as someone revved it hard. We all went still, heads cocked, listening. The engine noise grew louder, then cut off abruptly. My neck muscles tightened. A few seconds later, shouting carried across the water, too far to make out the words, but the tone was pure aggression. Then came the flat, dry crack of a gunshot, then another. Nobody suggested we go look. We stood there in the dim cabin and let the noise write its own ending. When silence finally returned to the bay, Marek let out a long, shaky breath. "That's the part that scares me," he said. "The dead are a problem, sure, but the loud ones with fuel and guns? Those are the ones who will come take whatever you've got left." I nodded and looked at the covered windows. That's why the blankets stay up and the party lights are just rope in a box now. The storm started with a drop in pressure, not thunder. I stepped onto the deck, checked the sky, and saw a gray wall building over the mouth of the bay, the kind that means the wind is about to turn everything the wrong way. Isa came out beside me, hugging her arms against the chill. "That line is going to roll right over us," she said. "If it hits with the tide, this place is going to buck harder than it ever did for your weekend guests." Marek stood just inside the doorway, looking past us at the horizon. He asked how deep the pilings went and how long the chains had been there. I told him they were older than my business and that rust was the only thing I trusted less than people. We walked the float and checked it with a focus we hadn't needed yesterday. Lines were doubled. Fenders were snug. The skiff sat on 2 bow lines and a stern tie to a third point in case one failed. Marek ran his hand along each rope, checking for frayed spots. "If anything goes, it will be a rotten ring or a bad knot, so we put the pull where the posts are thickest," he said. We shifted the lines one by one until nothing slipped when the cabin rocked. Inside, we pulled down anything that could fly or rattle. Isa took the lighter cans off the high shelf and stacked them low against the wall. I dragged the table a little away from the big window so that if the glass cracked, the first shards would not land where we cooked. Marek stripped the mattress off the bed and leaned it against the smallest window so we had one more layer if something hit from outside. By noon, the first real gusts came down the bay, hard enough to shove the cabin sideways before the lines snatched it back. Rain started as dots and turned to sheets that erased the far point and hid most of town. The noise built fast, rain on the roof, wind in the bare masts of dead sailboats, and the long roll of water hitting the seawall. Inside, we kept our voices under that noise and leaned closer when we had to talk. I lit the small stove early so we would have hot water if the panel stopped charging. The 3 of us sat on the floor around the pot while it rattled on its grate. Marek watched the flame and said, "Once this really hits, we don't open that door for anything. I do not care what we hear." Isa agreed, saying nobody who still made good choices would pick this hour to visit. The first big hit landed mid-afternoon. A gust slammed into the side of the cabin and the float lurched. One hard swing and then smaller ones that made dishes click until Isa pressed her hand against the cabinet. One fender squealed and settled. We felt the pilings take the strain through our feet. Isa kept her hand on the wood. "How bad does this get out here?" "Summer blows can pick a chair off the deck," I said. "Winter storms can throw spray higher than the roof. This cabin rode all of that with drunk fishermen inside, so it can ride this with 3 people who are actually trying." A flash rolled across the clouds, more a flat white glow than a bolt, and a few seconds later the thunder reached us as a long rumble. Marek looked toward the covered window. "If the power stations pop, tonight is going to look like the 4th of July for all the wrong reasons." Rain pounded steadily on the roof and the cabin rocked on its chains like a slow pendulum. Sometimes the swings grew wide, sometimes they shortened when the wind shifted. Once something big hit a piling with a deep thud and scraped along the float. Marek counted the hits and said quietly that if anyone was still on that hull, there was nothing we could do for them without joining them. We stayed off the deck. The blankets on the windows puffed with each blast, and drafts found new paths under the door, even with the dresser braced against it. I checked the straps twice and felt them jerk in my hands when a fresh gust hit, reminding me that wind and water could hammer a wall the same way a crowd could. By early evening, the sky was one solid sheet and the town was just a darker lump. The power must have gone out again because no house lights cut through the rain. We were about to light one small lamp when a sharp white beam swept across the ridge above town from left to right, too steady to be lightning. All three of us saw it through the cut in the blanket, one clean sweep, then another from farther down the bay. Marek swore under his breath. "They're signaling like this is still just bad weather." Issa leaned closer and asked who still thought they could run big plans with half the city dead. A motor turned over near the outer channel, high-pitched and strong. Even through the storm, we heard short shouted orders, the kind of bark people use when they are telling others where to go. A third light came on near the old fuel dock, a narrow cone shoved into the rain. "They are moving boats in this," Issa said. "They're not doing it for fun," I told her. "They're either trying to run from something worse or line up for another grab at whatever was left on these shores." Marek added that anyone burning that much fuel had a list in their head, and that people like that rarely left anything they wanted behind. We watched the beams cross again, and then a bright flare shot up from somewhere beyond the seawall, burned orange for a few seconds and fell into the water. That flare lit the promenade enough for us to see dark shapes turning toward it. Even with the storm noise, we heard the distant answer of the dead, a rough call that did not stop when the flare went out. None of the lights swept toward our cove. Our blankets stayed dark and our float jerked on the chains but held. Whatever plans the people with spotlights and engines were making across the bay, we were not part of them. On a night like that, hiding in our reinforced box on the water felt like the only smart choice left. People were louder than the dead, and the storm proved it. The morning after the worst gusts finally died down, the bay was a mess of torn branches, plastic debris, and two half-sunk recreational boats drifting aimlessly without owners. We stood on the damp deck and watched a white plastic lawn chair bump against the side of our float, spin once in the current and drift away toward the open water. The ancient pilings in our doubled lines had held. The cabin had survived a night that would have sent my old weekend guests packing before dawn. But the first thing we heard once the wind eased wasn't the dragging sound of the dead on shore. It was an engine. It started near the outer channel markers, a harsh metallic cough that quickly settled into a steady, throaty growl. Another engine answered it, closer to the town side. Issa set her coffee mug down on the rail with a deliberate click. Nobody who still has that much gas left is just out for a joyride. Marek squinted at the gray horizon. People who run big motors right after a storm are either desperate or they're convinced the rules are gone for good. "Get inside," I said, my voice low. "Kill the light." We stepped back from the rail and closed the door, sliding the deadbolt home until we were just three shadows standing behind the blanketed window. The engines grew louder, cutting aggressively across the bay instead of hugging the shoreline. Through the narrow strip of uncovered glass, we saw two boats moving in a slow, sweeping search pattern, one lead vessel followed by a larger support craft. The lead was a center console sport fisher with a high T-top and a blindingly bright spotlight mounted on the bow. The boat behind it rode lower and heavier in the water, the kind of sturdy workboat commercial fishermen use outside the bay. A man on the lead boat shouted over the idle, his voice amplified by the water. "Check every float and dock. People are sitting on supplies out here. Nobody wastes space today." Someone on the second boat yelled back, sounding frustrated. "We're low on fuel, Miller. We've taken enough risks already." The first man swore loud enough for us to hear it clearly. "If we run dry, we take another tank from someone slower. Now sweep the shore." The boat slowed near the public pier. Shouts carried over the water as they called up to the dark windows of the waterfront buildings. No one answered. One of the men raised a rifle and fired a single shot into a storefront window just to see if anything moved inside. The glass shattered with a sharp crash. A cluster of the dead near the street turned slowly toward the sound and began pushing mindlessly against the metal railing. The shooters watched them for a moment, laughed, a harsh, ugly sound, and then moved on when nothing living appeared. Then the lead boat turned slightly toward our side of the bay. The spotlight beam swept across the water like a physical touch. It passed over the ruined dock where Issa had first stood, then over 2 empty moorings, and finally swung toward our cove. I held my breath and felt the float rock under my feet as a swell from their wake rolled in. For a terrifying moment, the beam hit the thick reeds directly outside our inlet. Every shape on the water turned into a blinding blur of light and shadow. Then just as the light reached us, the cabin swung on its chain with the tide, and the beam slid harmlessly away without catching the reflection of our covered windows. Issa let out a breath she had been holding. "If we had left those old party lights up," she whispered, "the bulbs would have flashed and given us away instantly." Marek exhaled slowly. "The chains just saved us twice, first in the storm, and now by making the cabin move like any other shadow out here." We stayed perfectly still until the engines grew faint and the voices turned into an indistinct murmur near the far point of land. That afternoon, huddled around the table, we talked about what would happen if a boat like that came straight into the cove. "If they're scared families," I said, tracing a grain in the wood, "we share some water and point them toward the far marsh. We help." "And if they come in shouting orders and pointing rifles?" Issa asked, her eyes hard. "Then we don't open the door," I said. 3 people on one float against a boatload with engines and high ground isn't a fight, it's a mistake." Issa nodded. "I don't trust anyone who talks about taking things more than once in a sentence. That's not panic, that's a plan." Marek leaned forward, his voice serious. "Desperate men in tight quarters fire too soon and listen too late. The best way to survive them isn't to shoot back, it's not to be where they're aiming." We wrote one rule in our heads that day. If a loud group came to our inlet, we went completely silent. No lamp, no answer, no movement near the windows. If they tried to force a boarding, we would wait until they stepped onto the wrong edge of the float, cut one mooring line to destabilize the platform, and let the cabin swing violently while we pressed against the opposite wall. The dead never made us have conversations like that. The dead were simple. If they heard noise, they moved toward it. If they hit a barrier, they pushed until their bodies gave out or something broke. There was no malice, just hunger. People were different. They lied, they bluffed, they changed their minds halfway through a promise, and lately they were carrying more weapons than patience. 2 days after the storm, just before sunset, we heard another engine. This one was smaller, rougher, a 2-stroke whine moving slowly along the near shore. Issa looked through the gap and signaled us. "Old aluminum skiff," she whispered. 3 figures, 1 rowing, 2 holding long objects across their laps. They checked each dock methodically. They stopped at one where a small sailboat was still tied up. Marek watched them lean over the rails and shook his head. "They're stripping anything useful. Fuel lines, batteries. They aren't looking for friends." As they pulled away, one of the men in the skiff raised a shotgun and fired into the air for absolutely no reason. Boom! The echo rolled down the bay, startling birds from the trees. Almost immediately, it was answered by the distant groaning calls of the dead from the woods. We watched from our dark cabin and did nothing. The skiff never turned toward our cove. They moved on, louder than the wind had been, leaving the water dirtier and more dangerous than they found it. When they were finally gone, the only trace was one more empty mooring and the grim reminder that every time a motor started now, it was the living we had to fear first, and the dead second. 30 days isn't a clean, tidy number on a float. Out here, there is no wall calendar to mark off with a red pen, no office clock humming on the wall. There are only dwindling rows of cans, the water level in the jugs, and the way your joints ache when you try to stand up after sleeping on a damp floor. We built a routine because drifting, both mentally and physically, made everything worse. Chaos was the enemy just as much as the things on shore were. At first light, whoever woke up first would crawl to the narrow gap in the window, covering and listen. If it was only the wind and the slap of water, we moved around in what we called normal quiet, soft steps, whispered words. But if we heard engines, shouting, or the uneven rhythmic scrape of bodies dragging along concrete, we went to storm quiet. We sat like statues and waited it out. Only when the wrong sounds faded did we dare to crack the bolt on the door and step out into the gray morning. Breakfast was the same ritual every single day. 1 pot of water boiled on the small stove, 1 measured scoop of oats or rice, 1 can of protein split meticulously 3 ways. Isa kept the inventory list like a holy text, marking each item when we opened it and again when we tossed the empty tin into the trash bag. There was one morning when Marek, driven by hunger, scraped his spoon loudly along the bottom of a peanut butter jar to get an extra streak of oil. Isa just tapped her pencil on the paper. Tap, tap, tap. He stopped instantly, put the spoon down, and looked at his hands. She didn't have to say a word. We all knew the math. Work divided itself without a meeting. I took responsibility for the structure, checking the chains for stress fractures, inspecting the ropes for chafe, monitoring the battery levels, and measuring the water tank under the floorboards. Isa took charge of the consumables and the surveillance. She tracked every calorie, watched the shoreline for movement, and noted which windows in the town still flickered with candlelight at night. Marek handled the fuel, the tools, and anything with moving parts. Together, we shifted the contents of the cabin until every task took up less space and made less noise. Tools lived in fixed, non-negotiable spots so we could find them in pitch darkness. The roll of duct tape hung on the hook by the stove. The heavy pry bar leaned exactly beside the door frame. Rags were folded in one specific crate under the table. After a few nights of snapping awake to some new, unidentified bump against the hull, knowing exactly where the weapon was felt like the only way to stay calm enough to make a decision. We split the day into loose watches to keep eyes on the water. Isa liked the first light at the side window, reading the shore as the houses slowly emerged from the shadows. Marek preferred the late afternoon, when the harsh glare off the water made it harder for anyone on land to see inside our darkened box. I took most of the deep hours, the graveyard shift, when the dead called to each other in broken guttural sounds and the bay carried the noise of slow splashes that were too heavy to belong to fish. Sleep came in short, jagged pieces. None of us slept so deeply that we missed the float moving wrong. A heavy, unexpected knock against the hull meant 3 people awake, sitting up and silent in under 2 seconds. Sometimes it was just debris drifting on the tide. Sometimes it was a half-sunk boat scraping along our fenders. Once it was a body that had hooked its clothes on a cleat for a few seconds before the current peeled its fingers away and took it back into the dark. We almost never talked about leaving. The subject was too heavy. Once under a thin strip of stars visible through the door crack, Marek asked quietly, "Do you think we could cut across the marsh at dawn? Try to reach the old highway?" Isa didn't look up from her list. "The last time I saw that road, it looked like a broken parking lot. Any plan built on if they don't see us isn't a real plan. It's a wish." I looked at Marek. "I watched that same highway from the hill before I came out here. The cars were already locked nose to nose. It's a trap, Marek, a 40-mile-long trap." Marek listened, nodded once, and let the idea die right there. So we kept our talk small, useful, and grounded. Could we hang another sheet of plastic off the roof to catch more rain? Could we stretch the gas by running the stove for 2 minutes less? How many tea lights were left for those cold, loud nights when blankets didn't feel like enough protection? The food pile shrank, but we stayed just ahead of panic. We watered the rice until it was thin soup. We split cans 3 ways even when our stomachs cramped. We saved anything sweet, fruit cocktail, a stray chocolate bar, for the bad hours. If somebody came off watch with that distant hollow stare, half a peach from a jar did more good than any pep talk. Isa kept 1 sealed can of beef stew all the way at the back of the cabinet. She said it was there for our heads, not our stomachs. As long as there was one full heavy thing left that we hadn't touched, we weren't at the end yet. We spoke less as the days stacked up, but what we said counted more. We asked simple questions and answered straight. Does that mooring line look worse than yesterday? Did you hear that engine turn over twice or just once? How long did the calling on shore last night? The answers bent the small parts of what we did next. By the time we reached what we agreed was about 30 days, the cabin didn't feel like a leftover rental anymore. It felt like a shell that had grown around us. The blankets on the glass were just our walls now. The water jugs had a rhythm, full, half, almost gone, empty, stacked to remind us what we had already burned through to stay alive. The safety straps on the door showed shiny patches where our hands always grabbed first to check the lock. Beyond the reeds, the world stayed cracked and broken. Engines still started in the distance. Gunshots still snapped through the air. The dead still answered the sound of metal on concrete. None of that sounded like an invitation to return, so we stayed with what we knew. A square of wood and plastic on old rusted chains, floating in a bay that was no longer anyone's vacation picture. It had quietly become our whole map, our entire world. For now, we stay. That's the simple version, the mantra I repeat to myself when my brain starts trying to write long-term plans it can't possibly finish. If you stood on the shore and looked out here through a pair of binoculars, all you would see is an old rental box floating on the tide, its windows blindfolded with heavy blankets. It looks dead. It looks empty. But from where we sit, inside the shell, it's the only place left on Earth that still makes any sense. We are a unit of 3 now. I run the door and the mooring lines, and I'm the one who snaps awake if the float moves wrong in the current. Issa watches the shore and the sky. She tracks the movement of the dead and counts every electric light that flickers on in the town at night, building a mental map of where the living are hiding. Marek mines the fuel, the tools, and anything with a motor that might save us or kill us. None of us asked for those jobs. We didn't hold a vote. The roles just stuck to the person who noticed the problem first. Most days start the same way. We listen, then we move. If the bay is quiet, we do the small, mundane things that make the next day livable. Tightening a knot that slipped during the night, wiping salt rust off a hinge, or filtering water. If the bay is loud, if engines are prowling or gunshots are echoing off the hills, we sit perfectly still and let other people and other mistakes burn themselves out far away. Staying alive out here feels less like a fight and more like a stubborn refusal to join everyone else's bad decisions. Sometimes the shortwave radio coughs to life, just enough to remind us that people still exist somewhere past this water. One afternoon, a voice cut through the static talking about a football stadium they were trying to clear and turn into a fortified camp. The speaker sounded exhausted but rehearsed, saying they needed bodies to work and bodies to guard. Issa listened for a minute, then turned the volume down until it was just a murmur. She said that any place asking for bodies was going to spend them fast, like currency. Marek agreed, muttering that if they were strong enough to broadcast a signal that wide, they didn't need 3 more tired people from a bay to save them. Another time, a different voice, cleaner, more confident, talked about a ferry taken over by survivors, a massive boat they were keeping offshore as a moving town. They listed what they had like a sales brochure: fresh water, hot food, a doctor, armed guards. They did not list what they wanted in return. I sat there and pictured us climbing onto that steel deck, trading this quiet wooden box for crowded metal, strict rules, and the paranoia of strangers. My chest tightened more than it did when I looked at the dead shuffling on the shore. I switched the radio off. We talk sometimes in the low light about what would actually make us leave. Marek says that if the dead started walking into the bay and not stopping, if they learned to walk underwater across the mud, we would need higher ground immediately. Issa says that if the boats with mounted guns started sweeping every inlet systematically, we would have to move before they mapped us. I say that if the solar panels finally died and the water tank ran dry, we'd have to risk the road or try our luck at somebody else's gates. But none of that is true today. The panels still charge enough for one LED light and the pump. The tank still holds water and the bay still throws down enough rain to refill us. We still have rows of cans, thin now, sure, but real enough to keep us moving. The dead on shore still lean mindlessly against barriers instead of learning to go around them. And the loud boats still burn their precious fuel somewhere else, chasing easier targets. So for now, we stay. We patch what breaks. We mark what runs low. We keep one can of stew we do not open and one escape plan we do not test until the math says we absolutely have to. We take turns talking when the dark feels heavier than usual. Because saying one honest sentence out loud beats letting your head invent lies in the silence. Issa says if someone had told her a month ago that she would feel safer in a stripped-out rental cabin than in her own third-floor apartment, she would have laughed them out of the parking lot. Marek says that if you give docks and engines long enough, they decide who really knows how to use them, and I say this cabin was built for people to forget their lives for 2 nights. It was a place for distraction. But somehow it ended up holding the only parts of our lives that still work. The bay might stay bad, it might get worse. Someone out there might eventually build a place that truly deserves the word safe again. A place with high walls, real doctors, and a way to sleep without keeping one ear open. If that happens and we hear about it and it sounds like more than just another trap for the desperate, maybe we will cut these lines and go see. But until then, this is where we are. An old floating cabin in a quiet, reed-choked inlet. 3 people who learned when not to move, waiting and listening while the rest of the world figures out what it wants to be. We don't owe the bay a storybook ending. We just owe ourselves one more day that doesn't sound like the screaming on the shore. For now, we stay. If you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. See you in the next one.